was 13, one of the many mischievous things my friends and I would do was go ding-dong ditching on Saturday nights. 10 years ago, we all lived in the same neighborhood in a typical suburban area. There were a lot fewer houses and more woods back then. Matt and I were the best at finding hiding spots, while James was the best at ringing the doorbell. One night, after ringing the doorbells of several houses, we came to a neighborhood that still had a lot of woods. The first house on the block was across the street from the woods, which made for a perfect hiding spot. James rang the doorbell, and the door opened immediately. A tall, burly man answered and immediately started yelling threats. We all laughed, as we always did. The man went back inside, but James couldn't resist and rang the doorbell again. This time, the door opened even faster and the man came out with a gun in his hand. We all looked at each other in terror. The man scanned the yard, then went to the center of the lawn and stopped to stare at us. We ducked down, hoping he wouldn't see us. After staring in our direction for 10 seconds, the man went back inside. James took advantage of this moment of inattention to sneak towards the man's front door. Matt and I watched him with bated breath. The man came back to the window and saw us. James rang the doorbell and then ran towards the door. The man didn't move for a minute, then turned around and pointed the gun at us. We all took off running like we were being chased by a predator. The man came outside and chased us. We ran for several blocks until we were sure we had shaken him. Mark explained that he had yelled when he saw the man scurry across the street into the woods with the gun in his hand. We didn't report the man, but we told some friends about what happened. Thankfully, the house was a long way from ours, so we never had to walk past it again. This experience taught us an important lesson: never prank people who might not have a good temper. It also made us realize that fear can be a very powerful emotion. Luckily, in that moment, we were lucky enough to escape. I lived in a house from hell for a couple of weeks. I was a college student and my parents were paying for a house. For me to live in unspoiled, I know well the house was modest, nothing fancy or huge, and I was happy with it well, for the first few days anyway. Then things quickly started getting strange on a rainy Saturday. With nothing to do, I was watching TV for a few hours. That was when I heard a scrape on my living room floor. I looked around the room thinking an animal got into the house or something. I sat back down and resumed watching TV. That was the first weird occurrence. The rain continued throughout the rest of the day and into the night, which made for an excuse to not go out. I stayed in watching more TV. In the living room, I perked up when I felt I heard something from the kitchen. Laughably, I took a pillow with me as I guessed some sort of weapon and walked over to the kitchen doorway. There in the middle of the dark kitchen was a box of Cheerios on the floor, spilling out hundreds of the tiny O's. I had no idea how that could have happened. Nevertheless, I dropped the pillow and began cleaning up the Cheerios off the floor. As I was doing so, I heard a creak like the sound weak areas of a wood floor make when someone steps on them. It was by the kitchen table. I looked up, but nobody was there. I knew I was going crazy. Now every little sound must have been making me paranoid. Cleaned the Cheerios and went back to watching TV. The thunder outside was getting louder as the bulk of the storm seemed of the storm outside before waking up to be passing overhead, yet I found it to be strangely relaxing. That was the last thing I remember appreciating the sound from what seemed to be an hour-long doze. The TV was still on, but that wasn't what woke me. I remember believing I woke up to a bang or a thud from downstairs. Regardless, I turned off the TV and marched upstairs to bed. The next day was normal, as was the day after that. It wasn't until the next gray, rainy day that strange things started happening again. I woke up in my bed that morning, feeling like I had been drinking all night the night before. I felt sicker than I'd ever felt with any hangover before. I didn't do much walking around that day. The gloomy, dark weather only made me more bedridden. I left the TV in my bedroom on all day just as background noise, with a garbage pail by my side in case I had to puke at midday. I muted the TV after hearing sounds coming from above me. The attic door was actually in my bedroom, and most of the attic was built over that bedroom. It wasn't just once thought I heard, it was 3 or 4. I managed to get out of bed despite the fact that every time I moved, I wanted to puke. I pulled the strength of the attic door down, took one of my old baseball bats with me, and climbed up the steps. I pulled the light switch down to light up the attics. There were a few old boxes that must have belonged to the previous owner scattered about, but I couldn't see any living things to produce those noises. I climbed back down quickly because I was kind of scared of that attic. There were no more noises until that night I woke up to it first. What I thought was thunder, still feeling a bit sick. The familiar sound of a thud from up in the attic gave me chills. I pulled the string to the attic door back down, took my baseball bat once again, and climbed up the stairs. I made myself angry and screamed in the most intimidating voice I could. But before I could turn the light on, I heard the sound of a child giggling in the pitch black attic. Words cannot describe the feeling of weightlessness, the feeling of my insides dropping inside of my body. The fear that I felt. The word fear is not enough to describe what I felt at that moment. I was out of that house so fast I don't even remember running. I called my dad in the cold rain and asked him to pick me up. I explained everything the best I could. My parents. Things up with my parents the next day and moved back home. To this day, I'm convinced what I experienced in that house was completely paranormal. I used to work as a maid for some old lady for a couple of weeks. When I was 20, she had a really big yet old house on a property that could have been beautiful. She had actually taken care of it. She had 2 acres of land surrounded by woods in 3 directions, and the road on the other. The house itself was ancient, mostly made of wood, and the interior was really dark. She would often keep the blinds shut in some rooms for reasons I didn't understand. I would sometimes open the blinds to let some sunlight in, only to find that she deaf shut them. By the next time I entered the room, she lit some rooms by candle, which made the house seem even more prehistoric for me. Inside, to top it off, the wood floors were a creaky ecologist about everywhere in the house. The woman's name was Mel. She was around 70 years old. The kind of work Mel would have me do would be mostly physical stuff that she couldn't do very well anymore, like sweeping, dusting, cleaning dishes, doing laundry, sorting mail, and other things of that sort. One weekend, Mel asked me to sleep there for a night or 2. The house had like 4 bedrooms. Yet she lived alone, so it wasn't an issue. Well, this takes place over the course of a Friday and technically a Saturday as well. I arrived as per usual on Friday, speaking very few words. To Mel, I dropped my backpack full of my clothes and cosmetics onto the bed in the bedroom, but I was going to be sleeping in. As I turned to the door, I saw Mel standing by the doorway. She had a creepy way about her, and this entrance was no exception. She didn't say hello, which wasn't as weird as it sounds. She just instructed me to clean the bedroom right away. After that, she just told me to simply straighten up the whole house, and then she went upstairs. I didn't see her for the rest of the day, but I would occasionally hear her walking around upstairs in her bedroom. It was weird. She would seem to walk back and forth. There were no TVs in this house, so I didn't know what she could have been doing. One thing that I found bizarre was how protective she was of her basement. She made it clear it was completely off limits, and she didn't want me going down there. Nighttime came, and I went to bed early. This was before smartphones were a thing, so I didn't even know what time it was. It was probably 9 or 10 o'clock though. For the first few hours, everything was peaceful. However, I still had trouble falling asleep, given that it was the most uncomfortable bed I'd ever been, and it felt like hours later that I started hearing footsteps outside my room on the creaky floors. It sounded like Mel was passing my room really slowly. Maybe she was just going to the bathroom. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps again, but then she stopped outside my door up and listened. I could hear this time I sat, creaking from behind the door of Mel standing there, and it was starting to creep me out. She finally walked away. I heard her go down the stairs, and then I heard a door open and closed from downstairs. I had a feeling it was the basement door. It was a while later that I heard the door open and closed again, and then heavy, slow footsteps coming up the creaky stairs. The footsteps once again came to my door, then stopped. I sat up once again to listen, and I could hear creaks of pressure on the floor outside the door. And then I heard the doorknob start to turn. I laid back down and pulled the sheets over me and pretended to be asleep. I heard Mel take a few steps into the room, pause, and then weave. She went back to her room and shut the door. I was a bit disturbed. This was very bizarre behavior. I waited about half an hour before deciding I had to see what was in that basement. I got out of the rickety bed, tiptoed to the door, and then tiptoed down the stairs the best I could. I opened the heavy basement door, flipped on the lights, and crept down the stairs. I made it to the bottom step and held in. The urge to scream. There were two old wooden chairs dead center in the basement, and there were two of what I could only describe as decaying corpses, with wigs on them sitting in them. Sight of a bug crawling on one of them made me want to puke even more. I brought myself to walk deeper into the basement, closer to the corpses. I had to make sure they were real. Both of the corpses had men's wigs on them. The bigger of the two also had a beret on. I don't know much about corpses or their rate of decaying, but I'd say these corpses were both almost a year old. I felt like my heart stops momentarily when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs on the first floor. I couldn't make it to the light switch. I had no time. I hid behind one of them couches in the basement as I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming down one creepy stair at a time. I had my hands covering my mouth as I heard no reach the last air. I heard her whisper my name for half a second. I looked around the couch and saw Mel halfway across the basement already, with a big kitchen knife in her hand. I knew she would be too slow to catch me, so I ran for it to the stairs. She screamed my name and followed as fast as she could. When I made it to the first floor of the house, I ran upstairs to the bedroom I was sleeping and to grab my backpack. By the time I ran back downstairs, Mel was at the top basement stepped. I ran out the front door and topped my car. I turned it on, caught my breath, looked to the front door of the big old house, and saw Mel standing there. It drove off the huge property and down the road, making it back home within 10 minutes. Fortunately, I never gave Mel any of my information, such as my address or my phone number, so she was never able to contact me again. If I had to guess, I'd say one of those corpses belonged to her dead husband that she'd mentioned twice to me. As for the other smaller corpse, I have no idea, but regardless, it was a disturbing scene to witness, and something was way off about that woman.